tous, bienvenue à cette séance portant sur le racisme environnemental organisée par les comités de santé mondiale et des échanges cliniques du FMSA Québec. Je vous présente notre équipe organisatrice de cet atelier, Ying, Sophie, Juliette et Yihang, moi-même. Le racisme environnemental est un enjeu extrêmement intéressant qui nous a toutes beaucoup touchés et surprises, puisque nous avons découvert qu'il s'agissait d'un phénomène avec lequel nous vivions de près sans même nous en rendre compte. Nous espérons que ce sujet vous touchera autant qu'il nous a touchés.
So hello everyone, thank you for coming to our session on environmental racism this afternoon. We are Ying, Sophie, Juliette, and Yihang, the organizing team, and we're super excited to have you with us today. We can go for the schedule.
Parfait. Donc, pour l'ordre du jour aujourd'hui, premièrement, on va avoir deux présentations. Une de Catherine Delisle-Lheureux sur la justice environnementale au Québec. Puis ensuite, on va vous montrer le trailer du documentaire There's Something in the Water. Puis on va avoir la deuxième conférence donnée par Dr. Ingrid Waldron par la suite. Ensuite, nous allons être divisés en breakout rooms pour une petite discussion. Et ensuite, on va partager nos idées avec le groupe à la fin. Puis avant ça, j'ai oublié de le mentionner, mais on va avoir un petit question and answers. Donc, vous allez pouvoir poser vos questions aux conférenciers. Puis à la fin, c'est ça, on va avoir une petite conclusion. On va pouvoir partager nos idées tout le monde ensemble. Donc, dans le fond, le racisme environnemental, c'est quoi? Je vais vous donner une brève définition. En fait, vous pouvez la lire aussi si vous voulez. Donc, c'est toute politique, pratique ou directive liée à l'environnement et qui défavorise des individus, des groupes ou des communautés en raison de leur race ou de leur couleur. Ça touche particulièrement les gens de couleur, les communautés autochtones, aussi les personnes à faible revenu qui sont affectées de manière disproportionnée aux dangers environnementaux.
And as for a quick definition in English, environmental racism is defined by greenaction.org as the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, and environmental justice is defined as the movement's response to environmental racism.
Alors, maintenant, ça va être moi qui vais avoir le plaisir de vous présenter notre première conférencière pour cet atelier, qui va être Catherine Delisle-Lheureux. Catherine, c'est une étudiante en médecine allochtone qui a complété un baccalauréat et une maîtrise en anthropologie. Elle a participé à des activités militantes anticoloniales entre 2010 et 2015. Puis aujourd'hui, elle nous propose une réflexion sur l'enjeu de la justice environnementale en contexte colonial québécois à partir d'un exemple du Plan Nord, qui est un projet de développement économique ayant visé l'exploitation des ressources naturelles du nord de la province. Alors, c'est vraiment un plaisir de l'avoir parmi nous aujourd'hui. Alors, merci d'accueillir Catherine Delisle-Lheureux.
Je crois que je ne peux pas partager mon écran pour l'instant.
Maintenant, tu devrais pouvoir, ou Ying, peut-être tu peux te donner le droit à Catherine.
Ça devrait marcher.
Vous voyez bien?
Oui, c'est parfait.
OK, super. Donc, merci Sophie. C'est ça. Ben, on m'a déjà présenté, mais je vais quand même me représenter. Mon nom, c'est Catherine Delisle-Lheureux. J'ai fait différents projets en anthropologie. J'ai une formation en anthropologie avant la médecine. Et mon projet de maîtrise portait sur l'opposition de femmes inoues à l'exploitation minière dans le contexte d'un projet qui s'appelle le Plan Nord. Et c'est dans ce contexte-là qu'on m'a demandé de faire une présentation sur la justice environnementale. Puis c'est ça, avant de commencer, je voulais souligner que mon projet comme tel ne portait pas sur ce thème-là, même si intrinsèquement lié à la justice environnementale. Et je considère, comme je suis une personne allochtone et blanche, je ne suis pas la meilleure personne, je crois, pour parler d'enjeux de racisme environnemental. Je pense que c'est les personnes qui vivent cette situation-là qui sont les meilleures placées. Cela dit, je pense que ma présentation peut aider à stimuler des réflexions. Donc, ce que je pense faire aujourd'hui, c'est... juste un instant, je pense être ici. OK. Donc, ce que je pensais faire aujourd'hui, c'est d'abord de parler brièvement de mon projet de recherche pour ensuite parler un peu du sujet de la justice environnementale et ensuite, dans le fond, proposer une analyse à partir de différents thèmes qui sont ressortis de mon projet pour faire des liens et poser des questions en lien avec ce sujet-là à la fin. Donc, voilà. Pour introduire mon projet de recherche, je devrais retourner en 2011, là où j'ai commencé à faire ma maîtrise. Et en fait, c'était l'année du lancement du Plan Nord. C'est quoi le Plan Nord? C'est en gros un projet qui visait la mise en valeur et l'exploitation des ressources naturelles au nord du 49e parallèle au Québec. Et donc, ce projet-là a stimulé énormément de réponses des populations autochtones, à la fois pour dénoncer ce projet, pardon, à la fois du côté des conseils de bande, donc des sphères politiques formelles, mais aussi à la base. Donc, il y avait des mouvements de résistance grassroots qui ont commencé à émerger un peu partout au Québec. Et parmi ces expressions de résistance-là, une qui a eu beaucoup d'attention au Québec était une marche organisée par des femmes inoues qu'on voit sur la photo ici. Donc, une marche qui était pour les mener de Maliotenam sur la Côte-Nord jusqu'à Montréal pour venir dénoncer le Plan Nord, entre autres choses. Elle dénonçait d'autres choses, mais parmi les choses qu'elle dénonçait se trouvait le Plan Nord. Et donc, elles ont marché 1000 km au mois de mars 2012. Et bien, évidemment, c'était le début de ma recherche. Je me posais plusieurs questions. J'étais en contact avec certaines de ces femmes-là et c'était vraiment intéressant de savoir, de connaître davantage les raisons pourquoi elles dénonçaient le Plan Nord, leur parcours d'engagement en lien avec l'exploitation nouvelle minière, qui n'était pas nouvelle. Et ce qui les poussait finalement à se mobiliser dans la défense du territoire. Donc, l'objectif explicite de mon projet était relativement politique, dans la mesure où le but, c'était de rendre visibles les voix politiques des femmes inoues. Et il s'est ancré en anthropologie des mines. Puis l'anthropologie des mines, c'est une discipline qui existe depuis les années 80, mais depuis les années 2000-2010, il y a vraiment une explosion des recherches faites dans ce domaine-là, notamment parce qu'il y a une explosion des activités minières autour du globe et que ça donne que beaucoup de ces projets miniers-là se retrouvent en territoire autochtone et près de communautés autochtones et personnes racisées également. Et au moment où j'ai fait ma recherche, ce qui m'avait frappé, c'est que cette littérature-là, et en particulier en Amérique du Nord, parlait pas beaucoup des femmes autochtones. Et lorsqu'elle parlait du sujet des femmes autochtones et des mines, c'était beaucoup pour parler des impacts miniers sur elles. Donc, évidemment, il y avait plein d'enjeux. Il y avait l'augmentation du travail du sexe, la déstabilisation des ménages, l'augmentation de la violence faite aux femmes. Il y avait différents enjeux qui ressortaient de la littérature. Mais malheureusement, on n'entendait pas beaucoup les voix politiques des femmes, c'est-à-dire les opinions et les revendications qu'elles portaient à travers leur mobilisation. Et dans le Plan Nord, les mêmes dynamiques se reproduisaient, donc voilà pour le projet. Donc, j'ai fait ce projet-là avec des femmes de Uashat Maniotenam et Matimicoche-Lac-John. Je vais vous en parler dans un instant de ces communautés. C'est un travail de terrain qui s'est déployé entre 2011 et 2014, avec un séjour comme plus concentré de 4 mois où j'ai résidé dans ces communautés-là. J'ai fait 27 entrevues semi-dirigées, donc 25 sur 27 étaient auprès de femmes inoues. Et l'analyse proposée aujourd'hui, dans le fond, elle va se concentrer sur Matimicoche-Lac-John, parce qu'on ne peut pas te parler de tout, mais aussi le cas de cette communauté-là, en fait, expose vraiment bien des enjeux d'injustice environnementale. Et c'est ça. Donc, autrement dit, aujourd'hui, c'est ça, je vais me concentrer sur la parole de femmes de cette résidente de Matimicoche-Lac-John. Et il y a également 3 personnes que j'ai rencontrées à Uashat et Maniotenam qui étaient des ex-résidentes et donc qui avaient des choses à dire au sujet de cette communauté-là. Donc, ici, on voit une carte du Québec avec le Labrador qui est en vert. Est-ce que vous voyez mon curseur?
Oui, on voit 4.
OK, parfait. Donc, c'est ça. Donc, vous voyez la ligne rouge, en fait, c'est la délimitation général du Nitassinan, qui est le territoire ancestral des Inuits. Et donc, des enjeux de justice et de racisme environnemental. Donc, ça part du constat qu'il y a une distribution environnementale à subir les impacts de la pollution découlant de l'industrialisation, la militarisation et la société de consommation. Ça implique aussi que les personnes affectées par la destruction environnementale dans leur environnement immédiat tendent à avoir moins de pouvoir dans la société, donc moins d'accès aux ressources monétaires, politiques et légales pour exposer les impacts de la destruction sur leur environnement et défendre leurs droits. La corrélation de ça, c'est que le contrôle des ressources et l'accès à un environnement sain. Et ça veut dire, en gros, que les personnes riches ont plus de pouvoir, plus de capacité d'extérioriser les impacts environnementaux qu'implique leur mode de vie, moins tendance à modifier des comportements non soutenables en contexte de crise environnementale. Voilà. OK, donc juste pour revenir au plan Nord, donc comme je l'ai souligné, c'est un projet qui était lancé en 2011 par le gouvernement libéral de Jean Charest. Il visait la mise en valeur des ressources naturelles au nord du 49e parallèle avec 80 milliards de dollars en investissement public sur 25 ans. Et une dimension de ce plan Nord-là, c'était que le gouvernement prévoyait l'établissement d'un partenariat avec les peuples autochtones et qu'une dimension importante de ce partenariat passerait par la signature d'ententes, non pas avec le gouvernement, mais entre les compagnies minières et les communautés. Et je ne vais pas beaucoup parler de l'aspect politique du plan Nord aujourd'hui, mais il y aurait vraiment, en fait, il y a une critique à faire de la façon dont ça s'est déployé. Rapidement, pour les mobilisations qui ont eu, j'ai fait une liste très générale des différentes mobilisations qui ont eu. Je veux attirer votre attention principalement sur la plus grande mobilisation qu'il y a eu à Matimekos-Lac-John et qui était un blocus qui a eu l'action de colons blancs en plein milieu des terres et non pas sur la rive du Saint-Laurent. Et donc, l'arrivée de la minière elle va mener à la création de la ville de Shefferville. Donc, Shefferville, c'est vraiment une ville de compagnie. Ça veut dire que c'est la minière qui va financer la construction des infrastructures et qui va amener à l'immigration d'un bassin de population de colons qui va travailler à la mine. Et donc, comme je l'ai dit, les Inuits, à ce moment-là, sont principalement nomades et les années 50, c'est vraiment une période de bouleversement très, très intense pour les Inuits. Donc, en même temps, il y a une migration massive de nouvelles populations non autochtones, qu'il y a des incitatives multiniveaux pour que les Inuits se sédentarisent, intègrent l'économie de marché. C'est aussi l'ouverture du pensionnat à Maliotenam. Donc, les enfants sont arrachés de leur famille, en fait, et sont mis au pensionnat. Donc, c'est vraiment une période très, très intense. Et il y a plusieurs familles dans ce contexte-là, justement, qui vont décider d'aller s'installer à Shefferville. Beaucoup des familles dont les territoires sont en fait autour de Shefferville. Donc, pour eux, c'est une façon de se rapprocher de leurs territoires familiaux. Et beaucoup de ces familles-là, dans le fond, les hommes vont aller travailler ou en tout cas essayer d'avoir des contrats pour travailler à la mine eux aussi. Donc, Donc, ça commence en fait 30 années d'exploitation minière à Shefferville. Ça va fermer en 1982, année où la grande majorité des Blancs vont quitter la ville et la fermeture de la ville de Shefferville va entraîner la destruction d'une majorité des infrastructures. Chose qui est vraiment surprenante dans le contexte où les Inuits, eux, ils partent pas, c'est chez eux carrément. Mais les instances politiques non autochtones ne vont pas penser que peut-être les Inuits pourraient vouloir ces infrastructures, bien qu'ils étaient occupés par tout le monde, en fait. Donc ça, les Inuits là, ben, de Matimicoche, c'est vraiment quelque chose qui a marqué la communauté, évidemment. Donc, le plan Nord à Matimicoche-Lac-John, qu'est-ce que c'est? Mais c'est surtout une relance des projets miniers. Donc, depuis 1982, ils ont été majoritaires, une population autochtone majoritaire, dans laquelle il y a encore des Blancs, mais très peu. Et depuis le lancement du plan Nord, en fait, il y a une explosion des activités minières dans la région. Donc, c'est plus un projet de mine, c'est plusieurs projets de mine. Et ici, je montre là une carte du gouvernement du Québec. On a quelques mines qui sont indiquées, notamment la mine numéro 6. C'est une mine, ben, ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est que la fosse du Labrador, c'est le fer qui est exploité, fait que c'est principalement des mines de fer. Numéro 6, c'est un projet Hôtel-Nuc qui prévoyait exploiter la plus grosse mine de l'histoire du Canada, tous métaux confondus. Plus proche de la ville comme telle, on a d'autres projets. Et ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est qu'ici, on montre les projets qui sont en phase d'exploration avancée ou exploitation minière, mais on ne montre pas toutes les claims qu'il y a eu, puis en fait, toutes les activités d'exploration minière aussi qui sont sur le territoire. Par ailleurs, l'autre côté, ici en blanc, on voit le territoire du Labrador et on ne voit pas, en fait, mais il y a d'autres mines qui sont là aussi. C'est juste qu'on ne les voit pas parce qu'il y a une délimitation de frontières, mais il y a aussi des projets de mines qui sont en développement de ce côté-là. Fait que vous sentez que, dans le fond, on est vraiment devant, là, c'est ça, des transformations vraiment, vraiment intenses pour la communauté. Puis c'est ça, juste pour souligner que Matimicoche-Lac-John, je vous ai parlé d'entente minière plus tôt, donc ils en ont signé 2 avec 2 compagnies minières différentes. Donc les enjeux, j'ai choisi certains enjeux de vous parler qui touchent vraiment le sujet de la justice environnementale, mais évidemment, il y a plusieurs autres enjeux qui pourraient être soulevés, mais que je n'ai pas le temps d'aborder aujourd'hui. Donc, le premier sujet, finalement, mais c'est le plus peut-être frappant ou évident, c'est la question de l'enclavement, de l'envahissement et de la diminution de l'accès au territoire. Donc, première chose, il y a un sentiment d'enclavement qui vient avec le fait d'être entouré par des projets de mines. Non seulement sont plus nombreux, mais individuellement plus imposants. Ici, j'ai des témoignages de femmes. Juste pour que vous sachiez, c'est tous des pseudonymes. Donc, pour conserver l'anonymat des personnes. Donc, on a Philomène qui nous dit « Dans le temps de l'Iron Ore, il y avait juste une compagnie. Là, c'est rendu New Millennium, Lim, Tata, CapEx, il y en a d'autres, Century. On est rendu encore bien. On ne finit pas, là. Là, on va être pogné en dedans. On ne pourra plus aller dans le bois comme on faisait avant. Je te le dis, on est entourés. Nous autres, on est pognés en plein milieu. » Camille nous dit quelque chose de semblable. Parce qu'ici, on avait signé les ententes New Millennium, Lim, et on avait dit juste 2 mines. C'est rendu quoi? 10 mines aux alentours de Shefferville. Ils viennent débarquer là, atterrir. C'est quoi la passe? C'est qui nous autres là-dedans? On est dans un trou, on va manger toutes les mines aux alentours de nous autres. Donc, ce sentiment d'enclavement-là se combine à la restriction d'accès au territoire. Puis là, je vais en parler plus tard, évidemment, restriction d'accès. La première restriction d'accès, c'est le fait que le territoire autour est détruit et changé complètement. Et donc, ça, concrètement, évidemment, ça diminue l'accès au territoire. Mais par ailleurs, il y a aussi le fait qu'il y a une forme de privatisation du territoire du fait que les mines sont présentes. Donc, ils mettent des barrières sur des routes, soit des nouvelles routes ou des routes qui étaient déjà présentes, qui étaient empruntées par les Inuits auparavant, où les Inuits se voient refuser l'accès, sinon ils doivent se faire escorter, comme on le voit ici, pour se rendre sur un territoire qui est le leur. Et l'autre chose, c'est le sentiment d'envahissement qui vient avec la proximité des activités minières, l'augmentation de la poussière pendant l'été et également la saleté qui est amenée dans les camions, en fait, qui reviennent des mines puis qui amènent beaucoup de saleté, en fait, dans la communauté qui signe un manque de respect total là, aux yeux des femmes que j'ai rencontrées. Le deuxième point, c'est évidemment les inquiétudes liées à la santé individuelle, qui étaient vraiment omniprésents, évidemment, avec les témoignages que j'ai eus. Donc, et en particulier, ça touchait beaucoup la question de l'eau, de la qualité de l'air. La première chose, la contamination de l'eau. Donc, il y a différentes sources d'eau potable à Matimicoche-Lac-John et il y a une proximité évidente avec les activités minières. Donc, beaucoup d'inquiétudes par rapport à ça. L'autre chose, c'est la diminution de la qualité de l'air. Comme je le disais, on est proche des mines. L'été, c'est là où il y a le plus d'activités minières et il y avait la question, là, moi j'étais là en hiver, fait que j'ai pas constaté ça, mais apparemment que la qualité de l'air l'été est vraiment difficile. Donc on a Edith qui nous dit « C'est plus l'inquiétude pour nos générations futures. Qu'est-ce qui va se passer avec eux autres? En ce qui concerne l'eau. Ça, ce qu'ils font là, ça affecte l'eau. C'est là où qu'ils envoient leurs déchets. Quand ils font des trous, l'eau qui sort, c'est du fer. Puis ça s'en va. Ils boivent ça, nos petits-enfants qui sont là. Puis là, eux autres, ils boivent ça, ils se lavent avec ça. Puis je pense à eux autres. C'est qui se préoccupe des enfants, des familles? » Camille dit « On dirait qu'on est des malades. On n'est pas intelligents, nous les Inuits. On dirait qu'ils s'en calissent, qu'ils continuent leur travail pareil, même avec la pollution qu'ils font de l'eau. Même si on les avertit, ils continuent pareil. C'est comme si c'est pas grave. » Puis en fait, l'affirmation de Camille elle reflétait beaucoup un thème qui était vraiment omniprésent dans toutes les entrevues que j'ai faites à Matimicoche-Lac-John. C'était vraiment très, très présent. C'est bien évidemment le vécu du racisme. Puis comment ça se traduisait, là, constamment, c'était l'impression que les Inuits sont pris pour des personnes non intelligentes ou des personnes de valeur inférieure aux Blancs. Donc, aux yeux des femmes, dans le fond, les Inuits seraient pris comme des personnes qui sont inconscientes des effets de la pollution sur leur santé, seraient indifférents au fait d'obtenir des emplois en bas de la hiérarchie sociale, donc des emplois dans les mines, seraient incapables de comprendre les règles de l'industrie minière, ne mériteraient pas d'être écoutés, informés, consultés ou encore dédommagés. Donc, j'ai quelques extraits ici. Camille nous parle du fait qu'elle est allée sur le territoire de sa famille pour faire la chasse et en arrivant là, elle réalise qu'il y a des travaux d'exploration minière. Donc, il y a des travailleurs qui sont en train de creuser dans le territoire et qui n'étaient pas au courant, qui n'avaient pas été informés de ces travaux-là. C'est pour ça que je te dis, on est comme des imbéciles, on est fous, on s'en calisse de nous autres. Les travailleurs se disent, on va aller atterrir là, on va aller travailler là, on fait ce qu'on veut. Mais ce n'est pas tout le monde qui est fou puis folle là-dedans, on est conscient puis ça devient frustrant, on est en colère. Edith, elle parle justement des emplois dans les mines qui sont apparemment principalement des emplois justement en bas de la hiérarchie sociale, donc hiérarchie du travail, pardon. Puis les gens pensent, la plupart du temps, les Inuits ne sont pas Puis les gens pensent, la plupart du temps, que les Inuits ne sont pas intelligents puis qu'ils ne sont même pas conscients de ça. Ce n'est pas vrai. On est conscient, mais on est comme découragé de vivre ça. On dirait qu'on ne voit pas le bout. Tu veux travailler, tu veux faire autre chose pour tes enfants, mais il y a quelque chose qui t'enfonce. Et enfin, Émilie, qui avait justement dénoncé la saleté dans la communauté et demandé que les camions nettoient nettoie les camions, que les camions soient nettoyés avant d'entrer dans la communauté. Elle dit, c'est parce que c'est nous autres, nous sommes des Inuits. On est des gens cinglés, c'est comme si on n'est pas intelligent. Mais si cette suggestion-là serait venue d'un Blanc, il l'aurait écoutée, mais venant d'un Inuit, non. Donc, autrement dit, les témoignages y révèlent qu'en réalité, les Inuits, il y a un ras-le-bol d'un traitement différencié et du peu de progrès dans la lutte au racisme et à l'ignorance. Ils affirment leur droit d'être informés, consultés, le pouvoir de s'autodéterminer et revendiquent le droit à un environnement sain et au contrôle de leur territoire. Le dernier point que je voulais aborder, c'est la question, bien entendu, de la perte du territoire, qui est vraiment un enjeu centrale à plusieurs égards, entre autres à cause de la relation que les Inuits ont avec leur territoire puis l'importance fondamentale qu'ils jouent dans leur vie. J'ai soulevé juste quelques éléments, en fait, qui font en sorte que le territoire, c'est pas juste un endroit de mise à profit de ses ressources. C'est un lieu d'ancrage de l'identité et de la culture Innu. C'est un accès à un mode de vie, à la nourriture, à la médecine Innu. C'est un lieu de connexion à son histoire et à ses ancêtres. C'est un lieu de transmission aux enfants essentiel à la survie culturelle. C'est un lieu de rassemblement des familles et de la communauté. C'est un lieu de ressourcement et de guérison. Donc, d'abord, on a Philomène qui nous a parlé de la perte de lien à son histoire et à ses ancêtres. S'ils détruisent tout ça, c'est quoi qu'il va rester? C'est ça que j'ai pensé. Quand j'allais avec mes grands-parents, quand j'étais jeune, je jouais dehors. Je le vois encore comme si c'était hier. Quand on allait à la pêche, ce qu'on faisait, c'était des portages qu'on appelle. Tu portages tous tes bagages pour aller chercher l'autre lac. Je connais tout ça, je les vois. Même les rivières, les lacs où on pêchait. C'est ça, là. Je me voyais détruire par les compagnies. L'autre aspect qui est vraiment souligné aussi dans les entretiens, c'est la destruction et l'altération majeure du visage du territoire. Donc, ce qui est important de comprendre, c'est que ce que m'ont partagé les femmes que j'ai rencontrées, en fait, c'est que le territoire, c'est pas un territoire vierge comme les non-autochtones le pensent. Pour les Inuits, en fait, le territoire, il est complètement, il est habité par des marques de passage de leurs ancêtres. Il y a des points de repère. Donc, c'est vraiment un endroit qui est connu et qui est activement fréquenté. Puis, un exemple qui est revenu souvent, c'est le fait que les chemins empruntés par les Inuits, en fait, c'est des marques concrètes dans le territoire. Quand on marche dans ces sentiers-là, en fait, il y a des crevasses dans le sol, tellement que ça fait des centaines d'années que les Inuits passent par les mêmes chemins. Fait que c'est cette altération-là du territoire qui est tellement intense pour eux. Il y a aussi Edith qui m'a parlé. Elle, en fait, c'était une des femmes que j'ai rencontrées qui avait passé une bonne partie de son enfance avec un mode de vie principalement nomade. Donc, elle vivait avec ses deux parents de chasse et de pêche pendant de très longues périodes d'années et connaît son territoire comme le creux de sa main. Il me dit que la dernière fois qu'elle est allée, elle ne savait plus comment se retrouver sur son territoire parce que les montagnes, des choses aussi grosses que des montagnes qui lui permettaient de se retrouver dans le territoire, il était plus là, donc c'était impossible pour elle de savoir où elle était. Il y a aussi l'enjeu de la perte de lieu de transmission de la culture aux générations futures. Donc, Michel nous a dit « Oui, j'ai revendiqué ça pour moi, pour ma mère, parce que j'ai tout appris de ma mère, puis je ne veux pas m'effacer, je ne veux pas enterrer ce que ma mère m'a appris. Ce que ma mère m'a appris, je l'ai appris à ma fille, elle l'apprend à ses enfants de génération en génération. Puis j'avais parlé à ma fille de continuer tout le temps. Ils m'ont demandé « Pourquoi tu fais des blocus? Pourquoi ça? » Mon vécu, je veux le garder, je l'ai dans mon sang, je l'ai dans mon cœur, je ne vais jamais le détruire. Enfin, on a Solange qui m'a parlé de la perte de l'accès à la nourriture Inou et ce que ça signifiait pour elle. Pourquoi tu penses qu'il n'y a plus de caribou? Ça me dérange. Pourquoi? Parce que les animaux, ils disparaissent. C'est ça notre nourriture, les animaux. Je mange du porc-épic, je mange du lièvre, je mange de la perdrix, je mange du caribou, je mange tout ce qu'il y a à manger. Je ne mange pas d'écureuil, par exemple. Rire. Puis à force de creuser puis de couper du bois, il n'y en a plus. Va voir mon congélateur, il est vide. Ça fait 5 ans peut-être. Avant ça, j'en avais plein. J'avais 2 caribous pour l'année. Puis les caribous que j'avais, je pouvais les partager. Je pouvais faire des soupers, des réunions de famille. On mange du caribou, on s'appelle. C'était la fête tout le temps. Gruger, manger, savourer. Là, je n'ai pas de caribou. Il n'y en a plus. C'est ça que je dis, je quête. Ça se peut-tu quêter de la viande de caribou? Tu ferais-tu ça, toi, quêter pour manger? C'est ça. Quand je vois le plan Nord, c'est ça que je vois, mon manger, ma survie. Oui, j'ai une épicerie juste à côté. Je ne crèverai pas de faim. Mais mon corps, il va demander de manger ce que je mange d'habitude. Ils n'en vendent pas du porc-épic à l'épicerie. Ils n'en vendent pas du lièvre comme moi j'en veux. Ils vendent du lapin. Je n'ai jamais mangé du lapin. Du lapin, c'est comme un chat, moi, je trouve. Donc, bref, il y a une atteinte du mode relationnel qui lie les Inuits au territoire, un territoire qui occupe une place centrale dans toutes les facettes de leur vie. Et le plan Nord porte préjudice à la santé des Inuits et leur capacité d'être en santé du point de vue de leur définition de la santé, qui est en fait beaucoup plus qu'une simple absence de maladie, qui est liée à l'occupation active du territoire par activation physique sur le territoire, l'accès à la nourriture et à la médecine, qui est liée à une santé individuelle, mais aussi collective, du point de vue familial, communautaire, intergénérationnel, et qui est liée à la survie culturelle des Inuits et au renouvellement sociétal. Donc voilà, en conclusion, je pensais peut-être poser une question. Si un tel déploiement du plan Nord aurait été possible à Matinecoche, Lac John, si elle avait été une communauté blanche. Donc, c'est une question rhétorique. Je pense que c'est difficile de répondre à une question plus que par oui ou par non, mais je pense que ce que ça démontre, c'est qu'il faut se poser cette question-là, puis qu'il y a clairement des choses à réfléchir par rapport à ça. J'ai posé différentes questions pour stimuler la conversation. Donc, pour qui est le plan Nord? De quelle création de richesse parle-t-on et à qui bénéficie-t-elle? Comment sont distribuées les répercussions négatives de ce projet? De quel développement parle-t-on? Quel avenir promet-on à Matimekoshlak-John? En quoi le racisme vécu par les Inuits affecte leur capacité à exiger des comptes quant à la surveillance des impacts environnementaux, à connaître leurs droits et les défendre, à se faire entendre? Et enfin, dans le plan Nord, l'importance que revêt le territoire pour les Inuits est-elle reconnue? Est-ce qu'une partie de l'injustice environnementale ne résiderait pas dans la négation des modes relationnels que les Inuits ont avec le territoire? Donc, voilà. Merci, Chinashkumitin.
Un gros merci, Catherine. Je vais juste repartager mon écran. Mais je veux vraiment te remercier, Catherine, pour ta présentation. Je trouve que c'est vraiment fou de voir qu'il y a les enjeux de justice environnementale et du racisme environnemental qui ne sont pas assez mis de l'avant, qui passent dans notre communauté au Québec devant nos yeux. Puis on nous en parle pas, on n'apprend pas ça à l'école. Puis là, on a mis l'accent sur un village, mais comme tu as dit, comme tu as mentionné tantôt, on aurait pu en parler beaucoup plus longtemps. Donc, je pense que la première étape, c'est vraiment d'en parler, d'être conscient que c'est un problème qui affecte aussi la santé de notre population. Donc, on a vraiment la responsabilité d'en prendre conscience, surtout en tant que futur professionnel de la santé. Donc, je trouve ça beau de voir une étudiante en médecine qui apporte un nouveau regard et une expertise. Donc, merci beaucoup d'avoir partagé ça avec nous aujourd'hui, Catherine.
Ça fait plaisir, merci.
Donc, il va y avoir une période de questions plus tard pour les gens qui voudraient poser des questions à Catherine et à Ingrid par la suite. Donc, on va pouvoir passer à notre deuxième présentation.
Yes, so I have the pleasure of introducing our next guest, Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who is a sociologist and associate professor in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University. Dr. Waldron has been the director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project for the past 8 years, where she continues her work on investigating the socioeconomic, political, and health impacts that environmental racism has in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. In 2017, she published her first book called There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities. This book went on to inspire the 2019 documentary called There's Something in the Water that's available on Netflix if you guys want to go check it out, which Dr. Waldron co-produced with Canadian actress and activist Ellen Page. This documentary is actually what inspired the theme of our session today. So we're extremely honored to have Dr. Waldron come speak to us about the health and mental health impacts of environmental racism in Indigenous and Black communities. Before I let Dr. Waldron talk to you, we'll just show you the trailer of the documentary really quick to give you some context and to encourage you all of you to go watch it.
Ça sera pas long, je pense que ça fonctionne pas. Ça sera pas long. Sorry. Je vais resharer le bon écran. Là, vous voyez?
Oui.
Good. Attendez, je pense que vous n'allez pas entendre mon son.
Ouais, on n'entend pas.
Ok, je recommence.
Je pense que tu dois share audio aussi.
Ouais, je m'excuse tellement. Ok, ça devrait fonctionner.
Nova Scotia, Canada's ocean playground. In some ways, Nova Scotia is the embodiment of what many view Canada to be, a sweet escape. But when you look beneath the surface, the picture-perfect image begins to crack.
environmental racism is a problem. In Canada, your postal code determines your health. So we know that where you live has bearing on your well-being. Indigenous and Black communities are the ones that tend to be located near hazardous sites.
When we got here, they decided they were going to put a dump where everything went. There was body parts, there was food, animals, anything and everything.
There were concerns about the impact on the environment.
That's what our community smells like.
In one view, in one instant, you'll realize why we are here.
How environmental racism has affected this community. It's killing us. This lady's husband died of cancer. All the family that lived in this house died of cancer. This man has cancer. Who knows which in our water?
The trust has been broken through several governments.
Come to us!
Step back or you're going to get arrested.
You are poisoning our water.
It's just another example of their disregard for our rights.
They're doing it, and they're not even tricking us. They're just doing it now.
Canada is not a nation. It's a corporation.
And it's time for it to stop.
The bottom line is that we're sick of being sick. We hope to heal from all this.
So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Waldron. Dr. Waldron, you can share your screen.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody see it? See the PowerPoint? Yeah? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the health and mental health impacts of environmental racism. I find in general, health is absent from a lot of scholarly work in Canada on environmental racism, but even more so mental health and the psychological stressors associated with environmental racism is even more absent. So I really want to put a spotlight on that. And of course, it makes sense for a conference like this with students who are focused on health to discuss some of these issues. So I want to start with a quote from a really fantastic report by Cosmo and Kahiliani Pacheco that came out in 2015. It's a report that's based on community-based research. I would really encourage you to find this report and read it. It expands our understandings of environmental racism. They use the term environmental violence to discuss not only environmental racism, but every social and political and economic inequality that's impacting Indigenous communities. So they talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and poverty and everything that we consider to be forms of violence in our policies. So the person says here, from a traditional perspective, the health of our peoples cannot be separated from the health of our environment. The practice of our spirituality and the expression of our inherent right to self-determination upon which the mental, physical, and social health of our communities is based. This is highlighting that holistic understanding of health that is very much based on traditional Indigenous knowledges or traditional Indigenous epistemologies, where they believe that, you know, you cannot separate your health, your spiritual well-being, your psychological well-being, your social economic being. These things are intertwined, they're intersecting, you can never separate them. And that is also my belief in terms of how I understand health, and for the most part, for people of African descent as well. So when we think about environmental racism, we have to understand that it manifests within existing structural inequities, which is what the point that this quote is making. So across Canada, environmental racism, as you know, has had negative social, political, and health effects in Indigenous and Black communities. And in addition to the direct negative effects of pollutants and contaminants on physical health, we talk about to some extent, environmental hazards are often also appraised by residents as being stressful, and therefore it represents a severe or chronic psychological stressor that leads to mental health impacts. So when we have polluters, industrial polluters near to these typically disadvantaged communities, as I mentioned already, these communities are often already dealing with various stressors related to the social determinants of health. And that's a very familiar term with those of us who are in health. The social determinants of health include poverty and food insecurity and housing insecurity and underemployment and unemployment, housing insecurity. So these are communities that are disadvantaged because of all of those issues. But then when an industrial polluter comes into a particular community, it further compromises the health of that community. There's often, there's this term called the culture of distress. And it's also common to see the development of a culture of distress in communities dealing with environmental stressors. So when we talk about a culture of distress, we're talking about all the things I've just spoken about, you know, the social and environmental determinants that kind of weigh down on communities. It's a whole cultural, holistic kind of approach that we need to use in order to look at the full context of that community. It's not simply about health, it's not simply about environmental degradation, but it's about all of those social determinants of health that create that culture of distress. So taking all of these issues into consideration, in this presentation, I have three main objectives. I want to examine the specific ways in which Indigenous and Black communities experience environmental racism using case studies from across Canada. So from Nova Scotia as yes, but also from other parts of Canada. I want to provide some insight into the physical and mental health impacts of environmental racism coming from their words, right? So studies that I've done where they express how environmental racism has impacted their health and mental health, but also using the literature that outlines the health and mental health impacts of environmental racism. And then I want some takeaways for you as students, as junior scholars. What do you need to know? What do you need to think about as you are conducting research or getting into the medical field? Why is this information important? I always like to start with a definition of environmental racism, because when I started the project in Nova Scotia, people didn't know what it was. They never heard the term. And I have to be honest, I had never heard of the term as well. In 2012, when an environmental activist asked me to take on the project, he said, I want you to do a project on environmental racism. And I was like, huh? What's that? I've never heard of it. How can the environment be racist? Please tell me. And he told me about it, and I was very hesitant to take the project on because I thought this sounds way out, you know, and like I can't do something that's going to damage my credibility if this is not a fact. But as I continued to read about the topic, I said, it's racism in the policies. It's racism in the environmental assessment. It's the ideologies, racist ideologies that get embedded within environmental policies that then allow the spatial clustering of industry to occur in certain communities. So when we think about environmental racism, it's all about the policy that allows the clustering or spatial clustering of industries to happen in certain communities. One of the first things I did when I started the project in 2012 is to try to get to know the communities. I wanted to do community-based research. It was a right approach for this type of research, this focus. And I drove down to the communities in 2013 to meet with them and to get a sense of their priorities, but also for them to tell me, what do you think my research objectives should be? Because as professors, we always decide that before we put our ethics application in. You know, we decide what the objectives are, we decide what the research questions are, we decide what the methodology should be. And I said, well, if it's community-based, I can't make those decisions if I'm going to do this in collaboration with communities. So one of the communities I visited was the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. And this is James Desmond. He's a longtime environmental activist since the early 1970s. And he provides a really simple quote that defines environmental racism. Simple, but yet inclusive, because within that quote, all the principles of environmental racism are there. So he says, the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian communities, Native communities, and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism. It's environmental racism to its core, he said. So what is he saying then, if we unpack that? Well, he's talking about proximity, the disproportionate location or siting of polluting industries and other environmentally dangerous projects in communities that we would call racialized. Indigenous communities, African Nova Scotian communities, they are racialized communities, they are marginalized, but also poor white communities. In Nova Scotia, we have a poor white rural community called Harrietsfield, and they've had significant water issues since the 1980s, and they would say we haven't been heard either. So I would say disproportionately impacts non-white communities, but the definition of environmental racism has always included poor white communities as well. Yes, they have privilege because of whiteness, but they have disadvantages if they are poor, low income, or in isolated and rural areas. James also says that these are the communities that don't have a base to fight back. What is he saying? He's saying that they don't have economic clout. He's saying that they don't have political clout. When you are not seen by government, it's typically because you don't have political and economic clout to fight back. It doesn't mean that you can't fight back. Every single community has power. You've got personal power, but you're less likely to be heard by government if you don't have political and economic clout. So in that very simple definition, it packs a punch because it gives us, in many ways, a full definition of environmental racism. However, I do want to provide you with a much more, I guess it's academic definition of environmental racism, but you will notice that it reflects much of what James Desmond just said. So we have to talk about disproportionality. If I'm in a rush and somebody says, Ingrid, tell me what environmental racism is, I'm going to give them the first sentence if I'm in a rush, because that's basically what it's about. It's about the disproportionate siting, allocation, and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution. But it's also, as James mentioned, it's about the lack of political power. Communities want to resist the placement of industries and other environmental hazards in their communities, but they often lack a political voice or political power. Government typically doesn't take them seriously. These are sometimes also the communities that tend to not vote, right? And there's a reason they don't vote. They get frustrated. They think, well, what's the point of voting? Nothing's going to happen. But government knows that and says, well, these are people who don't vote, so we don't really have to care about them. It's also about the implementations of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening poisons in these communities. Earlier, I talked about the fact that it's environmental policies, and I was trying to figure out what's environmental racism. And then I was like, it's the environmental policies, it's the EAs, it's the environmental assessments that are used to decide where industry gets placed. So it's how those policies are implemented in a way that allows the clustering of industry in certain communities. But it's also about the disproportionate negative impact of environmental policies and the differential rates of cleanup. So I can look at Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotians and say to myself, they've been speaking out about it since 1985, but it's only last year in December that our government decided to close down the mill. Why are there differential rates of cleanup between white communities that might have environmental degradation and Indigenous communities? Why is it slower for them to get a response? You can see all these principles here are interconnected. And then finally, I think one kind of aspect of environmental racism that tends to not be talked about is the fact that these communities, the ones who are most impacted, are the ones that we do not see on environmental NGOs, on boards, on commissions, on regulatory bodies. If you look at any kind of NGO or ENGO in Nova Scotia, it's primarily made up of white middle-class women. And you're not seeing the communities around the table who are most impacted. So when you don't have the advantage of hearing from these communities because they're not sitting next to you, then you don't get a kind of first-hand understanding of how it impacts them and what are their priorities and what needs to be done from their perspective. So when that's absent, it allows environmental racism to generate over time. It's really hard to challenge it because you're not hearing from the people who are most impacted. So these are kind of principles of environmental racism that have been outlined by Robert Bullard, you'll see in that citation. And Robert Bullard is an African-American man currently teaching in Texas, who is considered to be the father of environmental racism. I would highly suggest that you read his work. Why I like his work is that he focuses on racism, but he also focuses on so many other issues that he sees as interconnected. He's now, discussing climate change, housing, transportation. Those of us who are in the environmental justice field know that there are interconnections to all of those things. So we should never strictly stay in this lane of environmental racism. We also have to make connections to climate change, climate justice, housing, transportation, because they're all connected. So there are several cases of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. I'll begin with Nova Scotia. This is Sabaganagati First Nation. You see Doreen Bernard walking along the Shubenacadie River. And Doreen Bernard is an elder and part of the grassroots grandmothers group. And they take on various environmental, social justice issues in their community. She's specifically from Indian Brook, that's where she lives. And they have been fighting the Alton Gas project since around 2014. This is Alton Gas from Alberta, yeah. And they propose to develop a brine discharge pipeline near the Shubenacadie River, which would allow natural gas to be stored in underground caverns near the river. And of course, there are concerns about the harmful impacts of this project on the community's health and well-being, on climate change, on fish, of course. So the community has been extremely concerned over the past several years and have made various strides over the past, I would say, 2 years in terms of resisting this project, most recently in April of this year, when they were approved. They have been saying for years that proper consultation hasn't been done, right? They've been saying that you never told us about this project, you never consulted us when it began. Yes, you told us about it midway, but you should have told us about it at the beginning. But our former Nova Scotia Environment Minister said, oh, consultations were done, everything is fine. And they got that overturned in April of this year. They took it to court and they won their appeal. So the court now in Nova Scotia has said you got to go back to the community and you got to do the consultations properly. So that's the government of Nova Scotia and also Alton Gas. Here's Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation. I would say one of the worst cases of environmental racism in Canada. Perhaps one of the worst is Amjinwang First Nation in Chemical Valley, near Chemical Valley, but this would be the worst in Nova Scotia. Northern Pulp built a pipeline in 1967 that has been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor since then. You will see in the film, the documentary at the end, that our government decided to close the mill. When we took the film to the Toronto International Film Festival, that part wasn't in there because we took the film to TIFF in September, but by just before Christmas last year, he made this big announcement, and then Ellen Page quickly put it in. This is a major achievement, major. This has been happening since 1967. It was a fertile fishing ground for this community, and to have the mill finally closed, which it did January 31st of this year, is a major achievement. So I have to say that I'm not much of a crier, but when I saw that in the film at the end, I had tears in my eyes because I know how long this community has been fighting. Here's another community. The federal and provincial governments fail to take responsibility for poor water quality in Fort Chipewyan, a remote urban community comprised mostly of Athabasca, Chipewyan, Mikisew Cree, and Métis people. This community is located downstream from Alberta's oil sands near Saskatchewan's Uranium City, which is considered to be the largest industrial project on the planet. Residents of this community have shared their concerns over the years that they are no longer able to swim, fish, or drink from the nearby water supply, and that they were being poisoned from contaminated water. Wet'suwet'en First Nation has been in the news, over the past, I would say, 2 years, and this is in British Columbia. So in British Columbia, then, the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation have come out against the coastal GasLink pipeline, which seeks to transport liquefied natural gas from northeast BC to a terminal on the coast near the town of Kitimat. And over the past several years, there have been mass demonstrations, sit-ins, and blockades that have gripped parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of the indigenous nation who are opposed to this multi-billion-dollar pipeline project in northern British Columbia. I talked earlier a bit about Amdinwang First Nation. This is near Sarnia, Ontario's Chemical Valley, and just that name, Chemical Valley, tells you what you need to know. I mean, this is a community that is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities. And of course, there are high rates of cancer and respiratory illness and reproductive illnesses. I mean, it's stunning. I talk about it in my book, so I don't have the exact kind of ratio, but there are many kind of birth anomalies in terms of male to female birth ratios that are out of whack, which is to me clear indication that there are health impacts of environmental degradation and polluting industries, even though some people would say that there isn't, right? But these anomalies are stunning. So similar to like Boat Harbor and anywhere else that you look at, there's certainly definitely a connection between cancer and reproductive illness and respiratory illness linked to industrial projects. People don't talk often about Black communities. And I would say it's because I feel I haven't found Black communities other than in Nova Scotia that are as impacted, right? It seems for whatever reason that when we have environmental racism impacting Black communities, it tends to be in Nova Scotia. I could be wrong. I've tried to find other places. I haven't been able to. It may have everything to do with rurality, right? It's easier to place environmentally dangerous projects in rural, once again, isolated areas. And in Nova Scotia, unlike Montreal and unlike Toronto and Ontario for the most part, although there are rural Black communities there, Nova Scotia is a rural province, but also the Black communities, 99% of them live in rural areas, right? We have one urban area that Black communities are known for, and that's the north end of Halifax. And that's an urban Black community, but that's undergoing gentrification. So they've been pushed out. What's unique about African Nova Scotians is that there are about 52 African Nova Scotian communities that we call historic African Nova Scotian communities. What makes them different from other Black people across Canada? Well, they've been in Canada for 300 years. Unlike other Black communities in Montreal, where they tend to be immigrant communities, or they may be born in Canada, but their parents are from Jamaica or Trinidad or Barbados. This is a community that would say to you, somebody would say to you, I'm 8th generation African Nova Scotian. So that's what makes them unique, but it's also because they tend to live in rural areas. It's much easier, as I said earlier, to put polluting industries in rural areas when you know that people can't fight back, that they're not going to be heard because they're so far away, that their voices don't get to be heard. So this is Africville. This is one of the historic African Nova Scotian communities. And I would say Africville is both an example of environmental racism and gentrification. I'm sure you know what gentrification is when you kind of push a community out to make way for industry and high-priced condos and businesses. So that's what happened in the mid-1960s. The city of Halifax wanted to make way for industrial development, and the community was expropriated. We call it the raising of Africville. There's a book called The Raising of Africville. They were pushed out of their communities. This was a flourishing community. I'm not going to say it was a wealthy community, but it was a connected community, and they were flourishing, and they had their own businesses. And then the city of Halifax says, we need you out, right? So they were pushed out into social housing in the center of Halifax, which is the North End, which I'm telling you about. So like these are descendants of Africville who then moved into the North End, which is that one urban area. So the people in the North End right now, many of them are descendants of Africville. Why is it also a case of environmental racism? Because when they were pushed out to make way for industry, what was left in its wake was various environmental hazards. A fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Here's Lincolnville. You saw a picture of James Desmond earlier. So this is his community, Lincolnville, and they've had a 1st and 2nd generation landfill in their community since 1974 and 2006, respectively. High rates of cancer, high rates of respiratory illness, and they would say it's connected to the first and second generation landfill. Why are they concerned about the second generation landfill? Because the lining that was put in place for the first generation landfill was never removed. So they are dealing with a very old, 40-year-old lining. And so they're worried that the contaminated water from the first generation landfill is seeping into the second generation landfill because that lining was never removed. There were promises that they would change the lining, but apparently it was a lot of money and it was never done. So they fought back in various ways over the years. You know Louise DeLille from the movie. She's the African Nova Scotian woman who's the first case study in the movie. This is her community, Shelburne. The Black community lives in the south end of Shelburne. The white community lives in the north end of Shelburne. The Black community has had a landfill, what they call the Shelburne Town Dump, since the early 1940s, and everything went in there. Medical waste, syringes, stuff used by the Army base, like really dangerous stuff went into that landfill. When I first met Louise at the end of 2015, because I hired her to do some focus groups, she sat in my office and she said, "Environmental racism, what is that? I never heard of it." And she said, "Ingrid, do you think that's the reason why 99% of the people in my community have cancer?" And I actually thought she was lying to me, because I thought there couldn't be any community where 99% of the people have cancer. That just sounds too out there. But it is the case that, I don't know what the rates are, but as you saw in the film, most people in the community have had cancer or currently have cancer. So that's a concern. But the other concern is the fact that this community has been on well water, right? So the white community in the north end has been on municipal town water, which we know is much cleaner. The Black community has been on well water. So once again, I'm saying we need to expand our understanding of environmental racism. This is a public infrastructure inequality, right? And Ellen talks about that in the film. What she didn't say in the film is that actually this year in March, she paid for a new well for the community, and that was all over the papers this year. $20-something thousand, I guess it was $23,000. Ellen agreed to pay for a community well in the south end. There was a big deal about it. The mayor of Shelburne said, "Nope, I don't want Ellen's gift." And they were like, "Well, Ellen is offering to pay for it. You don't have to pay for it." But she was like the mayor. She said, "You guys aren't going to use it. You know, the people in the south end, you're not going to use it." So I would suggest that that well come up to the north end where the people will use it. And it was a big fight, you know, because the north end is where the white community is. And there was a big fight, and Louise, who's in the film, said, "Nope, we're not stopping until you put that well, you allow that well to be placed in the south end." And finally, February of this year, the town council said, "Okay, we'll do it," because there's so much of a fight. So that's really kind of Ellen, and she wanted to keep that secret for a long time. And I said, "No, I want to make an announcement because this is just a really generous gift." So well water issues and the landfill issue are the two major concerns in South End Shelburne. So I talked a little bit about the connection between health and environmentally dangerous projects. We have a term for that. It's called environmental health inequities. And what the literature in Canada has shown is that there are environmental health inequities across racial dimensions, right? When you get Indigenous communities, Black communities, and you look at them across Canada, what you will find is that there are health issues that we can say with high probability are connected to those dangerous projects. So there are risks with contamination and pollution. And when we look at Amjinwan First Nation and Shelburne and what's the other one? Grassy Narrows First Nation and Louise's community, what we find typically is cancer. These are the major ones, the most serious ones: cancer, upper respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, temporary liver dysfunction, and seizures. But I also want to talk about gender. It's something that's not discussed often, because when we talk about the health effects of environmental racism, we must understand that it's also gendered in addition to racialized. It's racialized because racialized communities are disproportionately impacted by the health effects. of environmental racism. Why? Because they're disproportionately impacted by environmental racism. But we also have to bring gender into view, right? What are the specific ways in which Black and Indigenous women are impacted in terms of their health? Well, we have to talk about reproductive illness. We could talk about other issues like cancer, but just for today, I want to talk about reproductive health. So we also know that there are reproductive illnesses that are connected to toxic contaminants, and they include high levels of toxins in breast milk, placenta cord blood, blood serum, body fat, infertility, miscarriages, premature births, premature menopause, reproductive system cancers, inability to produce healthy children due to compromised endocrine and immune systems while in utero. So those are some of the reproductive health issues. And you should probably also know, when we talk about reproductive health, there continues to be a reproductive justice movement. In the 1980s, the reproductive justice movement was actually led by Indigenous women and continues to be led by them because they were fighting to have control over their reproductive choices, but also when we put those reproductive choices within the context of a community, whether or not a community is healthy or not, we have to engage in a discussion on environmental racism because we want a community context. We want to understand this from a community context. Reproductive justice is many things. It's about the right to have children or not, and to be able to parent your children if you decide to have children in a healthy and safe environment. So this is where environmental racism comes in. If the environment isn't healthy because it's polluted, then the government is compromising your ability to have healthy children. So since that time, the movement has been examining the various ways in which environmental racism compromises a woman's reproductive rights, so her right to have children or not, because perhaps the environment is compromised, but also her reproductive destiny and how her reproductive destiny is tied to the conditions of her community. Once again, we need a broad understanding of tied to the conditions of her community. Yes, we're talking about contaminants and pollutants, but if you also live in a community like many Indigenous people do, when we think about poverty, we think about income insecurity, we think about food insecurity, we think of housing insecurity. We know, all of us here know, because we are in health, that those are social determinants and social and environmental determinants of health that compromises our well-being, that we need to connect to environmental degradation. So all of those things need to be dealt with simultaneously, not just one, but all of them, because they all compromise your ability to raise your children in a healthy environment. As I said earlier at the beginning, stress is often not discussed. You know, I think health isn't discussed enough when we talk about environmental racism, but the psychological impacts of environmental degradation less so. There is a discussion now when we talk about climate change. People are talking about climate grief or eco-anxiety. You know, this fear of perhaps people your age, young people your age, who are saying, I don't know if I want to have children. I don't think I want to bring my children into this world with climate change. I'm scared, I'm anxious, and we call that eco-grief or climate anxiety. And I see increasingly people doing work in that area. So I think it's good, not enough, but I think it's great. But we also need to have a discussion on the mental health impacts of environmental racism, of polluting industries that are located near to Indigenous and Black communities, and how that impacts their psychological well-being. So I think of how it influences minority group members through negative effects related to certain psychological pathways associated with being part of that cultural or racial group. So there are two things happening. It's psychological pathways because you're living near to polluting industries, but also the image or the stigma of being a group that is near a dump. That is also stressful. Or the fear of drinking the water. When I think of Mary Desmond in Lincolnville, who I visited in 2013, and she said, My husband drank the water. He's dead now. He had various types of cancer, but I know he's dead now because he drank the water. I'm not going to drink the water. I'm going to continue to drink bottled water. That's a real fear, you know. So people don't talk about stress and anxiety because you know as health students that many of our chronic diseases like cancer are an outcome of stress. When we have cortisol levels that are raised, that predisposes all of us and makes us vulnerable to chronic illnesses. So many of the chronic illnesses that we are dealing with today, like cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, are essentially stress-related diseases. So here's like one of the participants from Lucasville, which is another African Nova Scotian community, and they had an equestrian farm in their community about 4 years ago that they were able to deal with finally. And one of the community members in my study said, and then talking about these physical industries, so she's talking about the farm, the horse farm, there's also a mental cost to that as well, to our mental health and well-being. When we know that all of this is happening around us and nobody is concerned enough to do anything about it, that takes its toll on your mental health. So it's not only your physical health that's being affected here, it's also your mental well-being. Louise Delisle in the film said something very similar. This is a press conference we held. We had just kind of developed an environmental rights bill in 2017, and we had a press conference at a popular restaurant in Halifax, and we invited the media, and she wanted to speak about the psychological effects of the landfill in her community. And what did she say? She said, environmental pollution is not only about cancer, it also causes a communal low self-esteem due to the stigma that comes with living near a dump. She said, if you live close to the dump, you weren't accepted, not just because you were Black, but simply because you live there, right? So it's this stigma of you're the people who live near the dump. You know, you're the dirty people who live near the dirty dump, is also a concern in terms of how people see themselves and the lack of empowerment that they feel that they can address that issue. So when I talked earlier at the beginning of my presentation, I said there's cultural distress. It's that cultural distress combined with a general lack of response by government that can tamper with or destroy a community's sense of self and sense of empowerment. So what have I been doing over the past 8 years to try to address this issue? As I said, I started in 2012 when an environmental activist in Halifax wanted to meet with me. And that's when I said to him, I've never heard of environmental racism. What is that? This sounds weird, out there, etc. But as I said, I decided to take it on. It seemed like a challenge. It seemed like an interesting challenge, and it seemed extremely political. And I said, this needs to be community-based. I'm going to be engaging Indigenous people, Black people. It needs to be community-based. So it's community-based, but it has also been collaborative. It's been interdisciplinary. It's been multi-sectoral. It's been multimedia. I said to myself, I want the Enrich Project to be all of these things because I think I want to be able to address this issue in multiple ways, not just through legislation, but in every way, in ways that we think are not important. Like for me, education is perhaps the most important. If we can educate young people in our schools about this, then that's half the problem because there are leaders, future leaders. They're going to get into government and perhaps they will make the right decision, unlike our government in Nova Scotia who have made the wrong decision for years, right? So education is key. So I said to myself initially, I want to attack this through different approaches. So I want to discuss some of those approaches. So I've had tons of public engagement events at our library. I've had workshops. I've had, it's public education, I guess you can call it. I've done that for the past 8 years a lot because I want to raise awareness and consciousness about the issue, because one of the first questions I got when I started was, what's environmental racism? Never heard of it. I got that from journalists and the regular community members, and I don't get that question anymore. And I'm not claiming that everybody knows what environmental racism is, but I don't get that question anymore, and I got it all the time. So I think the awareness raising I've done over the past 8 years has kind of worked, right? If you want people to act, they have to empathize. If you want them to empathize, they have to understand what the issue is. So that's why I think doing these events have been key in getting us where we're at right now in Nova Scotia. This is what I would say is my favorite event way back in 2015 at the Central Library. The woman standing is a politician, Lenore Zan, who I worked with on that bill. Doreen Bernard is in black. You saw her walking along the Shubenacadie River earlier. She's from the community of Sabaganagadi First Nation. Next to her is, I forgot her name right now, but she's in government. The woman in the blue is in the same community as James Desmond. You saw his photo earlier. She's in Lincolnville. And then the woman in the green is a noted activist. Her brother was Rocky Jones, who was a kind of civil rights leader who passed away in 2013. Her name is Lynn Jones. So what I try to do, of course, as we all do in our events, is to get people from different perspectives in different professions who can provide a different take on the issue. Lenore is going to provide the politician take, and Doreen Bernard from Sabaganagadi is going to provide the Indigenous take in her community specifically, and et cetera, et cetera. What I always do in my events is bring the Black community and the Indigenous community together, because when I arrived in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, I noticed, and I'm not criticizing it, but you would go to an event, it was just an Indigenous event. And you need an event that's an Indigenous event, of course, and there was a Black event. And I would look in the audience and I would see at the Black events, there were no Indigenous people in the audience. They were mostly white people. In the Indigenous events, the Black people weren't there. It was mostly, once again, white people. And I thought, I need to bring these two communities together. So every single event I have, it's both communities. And then when I turn back to the audience, I see a mix in a way that you just don't see. So I continue to do that in my work. Of course, as an academic, a scholar, a professor, I have to write, right? I have to publish. And this is my first book from 2018. There's Something in the Water. I wasn't planning to write a book, but I was asked to do it by the publisher. He invited me for coffee. This was Easter of 2015, and he said, I want you to write a book, and I want you to do it from the perspective of the Indigenous community and the Black community, and I want some history in there as well. And I wasn't really into it. I wanted to write some journal publications, because I thought that was much more important. But then I said, you know what, writing a book might be fun. So I started really kind of writing it in 2016. This is important because if you don't have evidence, people don't take you seriously. Of course, my job, as an academic, I have to write. But also, when I visited folks at Nova Scotia Department of Environment, one of the first questions they said to me is that, where's your evidence, Ingrid? You say that there are health effects. You say these communities have cancer. You're saying all these things, but where's the evidence? So I said to myself, I'm going to give you the evidence. I'm going to write a book, for all those naysayers, I'll give you the evidence. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to kind of not only discuss my research, but the scholars in Canada who have been doing this work, like Cheryl Tilak Singh at Ryerson University, and Michael Mascarenhas, who's in California now, but he's a Canadian. And Deborah McGregor, who's an Indigenous woman in the law faculty at York University. There were Canadian scholars who were doing this work, and I wanted to document it in this book so people know what's going on. So that was really key in terms of moving my project forward. Another thing that I did was hire a student to do a map. Once again, to silence the naysayers, right? This map was actually very, very much talked about when we released it. This was a student in health geography who used GIS analysis to show the location of industry in Indigenous and Black communities. So if you go onto my website, you will see 2 layers of that map. You'll see one layer for Indigenous communities, and I think the Indigenous community is blue. No, the Indigenous community is red, the red dot. And the blue dots are the Black community. And you can go on and it provides you with a template of how to navigate this map as well. But what it shows is that Indigenous communities, Black communities are certainly close in great numbers to polluting industries. We look specifically at incinerators, pulp and paper mills, and landfills. I also developed an NGO in 2017 because I met a geologist and he said, well, let's give the communities a win. Let's give them something tangible. Like events are great, legislation is great, but what can we do now to satisfy them, to give them a win? And we thought, okay, let's do a water testing project in Lincolnville. And we did a water testing project in Lincolnville in 2016 and it worked out really well. We conducted water testing. We trained the community how to test their own water. We trained environmental science students how to test water. We went back to the community and did a workshop. We discussed the results, and we also showed the community how to manage their drinking water sources. So we thought this worked really well, and this is a great blueprint for us to actually develop an NGO. And we did that, as I said, in 2017, and we recently got charitable status about a month ago, which allows us to get donations. So our mission then is to test water in rural, marginalized communities, not just Indigenous communities or Black communities, any community that's in a rural area. We test water and we do workshops. I've also collaborated with EcoJustice. It's a law charity across Canada, and they opened up an office, a new office in Halifax in 2018. And I met with them and I said, let me just tell you about the communities here that are dealing with environmental issues. And what they're doing is working with communities to identify legal remedies to address environmental racism. It could be private prosecution, could be a class action lawsuit, just to look at what community needs. I'm also working with some young women who are graduates of Dalhousie Sustainability College, and they actually were in the audience of one of my events, and one of them approached me and she said, Dr. Waldron, I'd love to work with you one day. And about a year later, we started working together. And this is going back to what I said earlier about education, educating young people. We are now looking at the high school and middle school curricula in Nova Scotia. The first thing that we did was an environmental scan. What are they teaching in the high school and middle school curricula? Are they teaching about Indigenous people? Are they teaching about African Nova Scotians? What about environmental racism? What about environmental justice? We found that they really aren't doing those things. They're really not teaching those things. So we did that environmental scan, and then we decided that we would do workshops to get a sense of what the Indigenous and Black communities wanted. What is our goal? Our goal is to develop tools and resources online for high school and middle school teachers to use in the classroom to teach about environmental racism. Our secondary goal, more long-term, is how do we transform the Nova Scotia high school curricula to embed environmental racism into courses. I'm also getting into climate change. I wouldn't say that it was something that I ever focused on, but I realize it is the issue of the day. So I've paired up with environmental professionals, retired environmental scientists, and we are hoping to do workshops in the African Nova Scotian community to talk about environmental issues like climate change, but also to prepare them for climate adaptation. How do you adapt to and prepare for climate change impacts? I train students. What's wonderful about environmental racism is that every single discipline is kind of relevant to environmental racism. Sociology students have come to my project, engineering students, planning students, I said sociology, medical students, health students. I've realized what an interdisciplinary topic environmental racism is, and law students, of course, because so many students have volunteered and supported the project over the years. So for me, it's exciting because it's so interdisciplinary, but also I get to learn from students. You know, they may say I'm learning from Dr. Waldron, but I say I'm learning from them, right? And sometimes what they want as well is to be able to meet communities. You know, they're sitting in their classes, bored maybe, and they want to actually meet the communities that they're hearing about, you know, Sabag and Agony. They've heard about them in the news. They want to meet them. So through my project, it's kind of an opportunity because I have the relationships with some of those communities to give students an opportunity to meet them. As you know, I'm really into multimedia, and this is about raising awareness once again. You know, tons of television interviews I've given, newspaper interviews, radio interviews, podcast interviews. I continue to do that because I want to continue to raise awareness about the issue. Of course, the film is one aspect of that multimedia approach, and Ellen Page reached out to me on Twitter in October of 2018. I was shocked, of course, that she was following me. But eventually, after many discussions, we decided that a film would be a good idea. And in April of 2019, she came to Halifax, where she was born actually, and we shot the film in about 6 days. And then we decided we would put it forward to Toronto International Film Festival and other film festivals in Ontario. So that was the beginning of this kind of journey. This is us on the red carpet at the Toronto International Film Festival. It was one of the most exciting times of my life. We were just running to different media outlets. I mean, media outlets I never thought I'd ever, like the Los Angeles Times and People Magazine and Rolling Stone. And I can't tell you what a thrill ride this was, and I still can't believe it actually happened. I was minding my own business, you know, and working, and this happened, but I will always remember this. It was great fun. And then in October, I knew that we were going to Netflix because we did sign the deal, and we knew that Netflix would be perhaps part of it. So in March of this year, it started streaming on Netflix. I'm currently, because I like art, I'm currently preparing for an event I'm organizing next Wednesday, where we will bring together community members from affected communities and artists, dancers, singers, poets. They're going to work in pairs, and they're going to do a piece on a community. So let's say Doreen in blue, her community is Sabaganagati. The piece is going to be on Sabaganagati First Nation, but Doreen as a community member and a dancer, Liliona, they're pairing up to do something together that will express what has happened in Sabaganagati First Nation. So it's kind of the bringing together of community, narratives, storytelling, and an artist who's going to perform. So I'm very excited for that event. It is on Zoom, so you guys can register. She's now an MP Liberal. Her and I collaborated on the first environmental racism bill in Nova Scotia back in 2015, never passed into law, went to second reading, reintroduced in 2018, but now she approached me this year before the pandemic hit. So we didn't know the pandemic was coming, of course, and February 26th, she introduced the bill, but she came to me and she said, why don't we modify that 2015 bill? And let's turn it into a federal bill for all of Canada. What do you think about that? I said, of course, I think this is great because it's for all of Canada. So February 26th, she introduced it. And then she said to me, Ingrid, would you like to come up to Ottawa and you can sit in the House of Commons and we can put it forward to second reading, and then the pandemic hit. So I said, what's happening now, Lenore? She said, well, we'll see what happens in the fall, but I don't know what's happening, so I've got to reach out to her because she said to me September 26th, which of course is passed. She said maybe we can put it forward then, but it's passed, right? But she also said that we could put it forward next year, so I've just got to reach out to her again. We got support from David Suzuki. We got support from Elizabeth May, who's a former Green Party leader, and we got support from, I think it's an MP, Indigenous MP from Manitoba. So we got some strong support. So I'm just crossing my fingers. I think legislation is a piece of the puzzle. I don't think it's everything, but I think it holds government accountable. It makes them transparent. It holds their feet to the fire. So I think legislation is key. I'm also developing a new national anti-environmental racism initiative with a guy in Toronto. This is for all of Canada. We've already have some partners on board. We are looking at environmental racism, yes, but we're also looking at climate change. We're looking at health. We're looking at food insecurity. We thought we would make this topic environment. And we're going to hold our first meeting in December with the people who have said that they want to be coalition members. So excited about that. I recently became part of a network with Peter Wood, who used to be at the Blue Dot Foundation, with the David Suzuki Foundation. And with the David Suzuki Foundation, they were fighting for the right to a healthy environment, but it never really took off. And he got frustrated. So he decided to reach out to me and the same guy I'm working with for that national coalition, and Dana Scott at York University in law. She's an environmental lawyer. And he said, let's form a network and let's see if we can get a right to a healthy environment. We can speak to Justin Trudeau. We can send Justin Trudeau a letter and say to him, you've known about these issues for so long. Why are you holding on to this? Why aren't you starting to address this? So the purpose of this network is to do some activism, send letters to Justin Trudeau, write op-eds that we can put in the newspapers to talk about the urgency. of environmental racism and climate change issues. So that's a very new network that I'm involved in. So what are the takeaways for students like yourselves and researchers in this field of health and environmental health and environmental racism? Well, we often talk as health scholars about the social gradient of health. Michael Marmot at the World Health Organization talked about the social gradient of health, the fact that if you are high income, member of an advantaged group, you're more likely to have good health than somebody who is of a low income, low socioeconomic group. So we know that. But when we talk about environmental racism, we've got to put that in the mix. It's not enough to talk about the health gradient without talking about how places and spaces impact our health, whether it's public infrastructure inequalities, the built environment, climate change, or environmental degradation. When we talk about the social gradient of health and the advantage, economically advantaged and privileged people who tend to have better health than those who are not, we've got to put environmental issues into that mix. Second, the potential adverse interactions between psychosocial stressors and environmental hazards. It means that you need to kind of change your paradigm, the ways in which you understand environmental health research to be inclusive of psychosocial stressors. But as I said earlier, that also needs to be inclusive of the social context, everything that's happening in that community. We cannot see them as independent factors. If we're looking at psychosocial stressors or environmental health issues, we also need to take stock of what's happening in that community around employment, underemployment, food security, income insecurity, and housing insecurity. Assessing the whole environment, not just polluting industries, is key. And finally, for researchers and students in medicine and the health professions, continue to expand your models to consider all of those multiple community aspects. So I talked about that report. That is a great report that talked about environmental violence. And they didn't just talk about industry, but they talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women. They talked about reproductive health issues. They talked about suicide, right? As health researchers, we cannot continue to support that medical model. That medical model says what? That we encounter illness only because there's some kind of malfunctioning in our bodies. The medical model is passé, right? We need to engage with a different understanding of health, one that considers the social, economic, and political environment within which we all live, work, and play. And that's essentially a social determinants of health model, but I would expand that, social and environmental determinants of health, because I find when we talk about social determinants of health, once again, environmental determinants gets left out, right? So we now need to start to broaden that to the social and ecological, or the social and environmental determinants of health, which is inclusive of everything. So I want to see health students and medical students do away with that archaic medical model. It has its place, but it's not enough. And we need to shift our paradigm to consider all of these things. So that's all I have to say, and I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here when I say that the presentation was very insightful, and also thank you so much for all the amazing work that you do. And it's quite shocking to learn that all of this is happening so close to home, and yet not many of us are aware of it. And I think that talks like this are very inspiring, and we can really see the concrete actions that are being done to address these issues. And I think this will spark some fruitful discussions among the people here today. And as not only as healthcare professionals, but also, citizens of Canada or of the world, I think we have the responsibility to not only acknowledge and address these issues, as you mentioned, the social and environmental determinants of health, social gradients of health, environmental health inequalities in our institutions and in our healthcare systems, but also just to be always open to learn more from these communities and do more concretely to try to remediate these issues. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, we'll just start with a quick Q&A section. So if any of the participants here have any questions for either Dr. Waldron or Catherine, you can type it in the chat, or you can unmute as well, since we're not that many people.
Peut-être en attendant que les gens écrivent leurs questions, moi j'aurais une question en premier pour Catherine. Je voudrais savoir si tu connais, si tu es au courant d'autres cas de racisme environnemental au Québec, peut-être particulièrement à Montréal ou ailleurs.
Oui, on en avait brièvement discuté, je pense, par chat, mais c'est vraiment une bonne question, puis je me pose la même question par rapport à Montréal. Ben, ce à quoi j'ai pensé en premier, c'était par rapport à Kanesatake, qui ont eu une lutte par rapport à une mine de niobium qui était supposée se faire sur le territoire. Puis je ne suis pas certaine si on est rendu où avec cette lutte-là, mais ça, c'était clairement quelque chose qui était dans les environs. Mais sinon, comme dans les environs de Montréal, je sais, mettons qu'avec les raffineries dans l'est de Montréal, c'est clairement un enjeu, à savoir l'exposition par rapport plus à les gens qui vivent à l'est de Montréal, mais puis que dans le fond, on se rapproche de Pointe-aux-Trembles, c'est clairement une région qui est défavorisée économiquement. Fait que je sais pas non plus, mais j'ai jamais entendu parler de recherche qui était faite par rapport à ça. Puis sinon, je pense juste dans le coin de Montréal, juste de façon générale, c'est clair que comme dans n'importe quelle ville, les régions qui sont le plus, comme juste géographiquement parlant, comment sont distribuées les routes principales, les routes secondaires, si on pense à l'échangeur turco, si on parle on pense à des voies de passage comme la rue Saint-Denis, ou toutes les personnes qui doivent vivre à côté des grandes autoroutes comme la 20 ou la 40 ou la 720, ben c'est clairement des endroits qui sont économiquement défavorisés. Puis souvent, c'est souvent la question de l'œuf ou la poule. Est-ce que justement, c'est des projets qui se sont développés là à cause que c'était défavorisé puis que les gens y ont moins de pouvoir pour dire non à certains projets, ou si c'est à cause qu'il y a justement moins de spéculation foncière qui fait en sorte que des personnes pauvres se retrouvent à vivre dans des milieux où il y a plus d'exposition. En tout cas, c'est juste des réflexions que j'ai comme ça, mais sinon, il faudrait que j'y pense plus, s'il y en a sûrement d'autres.
Ah, merci beaucoup. Je vais en profiter pour lire la question dans le chat de Nathan. Il dit, premièrement, merci beaucoup pour votre présentation. Cette question est dirigée à vous deux. Donc, Ying, tu pourras la traduire en anglais après. Le racisme environnemental implique plusieurs acteurs, les communautés marginalisées, les politiciens, le secteur industriel, nous, les étudiants en médecine. Quels sont alors les groupes clés qui doivent prêter renfort à ce mouvement contre le racisme environnemental?
Si peut-être laisser Catherine répondre en
okay.
premier.
C'est une bonne question. Je pense que, je pense que c'est comme un enjeu de santé publique, puis un enjeu qui devrait toucher tout le monde, puis qui devrait faire bouger tous les acteurs de la société. À mon sens, je pense que c'est une question aussi d'être à l'écoute, puis d'être comme finalement favoriser que les voix marginalisées dans l'espace public soient plus mises de l'avant pour que comme les gens se fassent écouter en quelque sorte. Fait que là, on rentrerait tout dans la question de la solidarité versus prendre parole pour d'autres. Mais je pense, ouais, c'est ça, j'ai pas de réponse plus précise, là, mais définitivement, je pense qu'on a besoin de plus de solidarité en différents groupes qui sont touchés de loin ou de près par des enjeux d'injustice environnementale pour faciliter la rencontre des différentes luttes.
Parfait. Je vais juste traduire en anglais for Dr. Waldron. So Nathan says, first, thank you so much for your presentation. And he says, environmental racism involves many actors, such as marginalized communities, politicians, the industrial sector, and also the people here today, so students in healthcare, who are, in your opinion, the key groups that must support this movement against environmental racism?
For me, well, number one, members of our community, so the public, and particularly young people your age, because I found that young people, young people are most engaged with, of course, and invested in climate change and environmental issues because it's impacting your future, right? And so I find in Nova Scotia and around in Canada in general, it's the young people that have the most energy around these issues. So I think the key groups are young people who are passionate about these issues and who are unrelenting in terms of calling out our government about some of these issues. And they're the ones who have been passionate about engaging in various types of civil disobedience actions, whether it's petitions or sit-ins. You know, I think of the Dalhousie students last year who sat in one of our government offices and they never left. So they sat in there for, I think, was the whole day, and they never moved. It's young people who have the guts to do those things. So I think without young people, it would probably be a fast movement. Number two, government, of course. We need to continue to mobilize government around these issues. They need to be more educated and aware. And we need to put, it's the young people and the members of the public that need to put pressure on the government. Without legislation, as Lenore Zan said, we can engage in civil disobedience, but without legislation, it's really difficult to address these issues, because with legislation, you've got certain strategies or steps that need to be taken where you're holding government accountable, and it sets out what government needs to do, right? In the case of the bills that we propose, they need to set up a tribunal, and they need to do this and that, and it's very transparent, and you tend to hold their feet to the fire. So without environmental legislation that centers the voices of Black and Indigenous communities, I'm not sure how much of this could be addressed. It's also industry. You know, industry, I talked about an environmental assessment in my talk. Environmental assessment don't consider vulnerability. They don't consider the fact that Indigenous communities, for example, suffer worse health outcomes, worse poverty, worse income insecurity, and how putting industry in their community further compromises the well-being of Indigenous communities, and Indigenous communities fare worse than any other community in Canada. So I think industry needs to be more educated in terms of the social determinants of health, and how by putting these industries in these communities, you are further impacting the well-being of these communities. But I think that, once again, schools, you know, I told you about the project that I'm doing. I really think that if the young people that we're talking about who are going to be in positions of power in Nova Scotia environment, in government in general, we need to get to them. And the only way to get to them is through the curriculum. But if they're not being taught about these issues, then they're going into the world and they're going to continue to make the same mistakes as the adults are making today. So for me, transforming the high school and middle school curricula is key, because you give them a different lens, you give them a different perspective, you give them a different understanding of the world, and they remember that, and they take those tools with them out into the world. And then when they become leaders, when they start to be hired in government, they keep those memories of what they were taught in school, and they make, hopefully, better decisions. And my experience in Nova Scotia, the young people that I interact with, many of whom are white, many of them get it. They've got the language. They're talking about colonialism and racism, and they're not afraid to talk about it as their parents might be, right? So I find the young people that I interact with, they're not scared to talk about racism. They're very open about talking about it. So it's those young people that I want to see in government. So schools have a critical part to play in all this.
Perfect. And we have another question from the chat as well. I'm not sure if it's addressed to both of you, but feel free to answer. It says, what can we do today to help and to create change? Are there any organizations that you would recommend? I think you can, or any of you can go ahead.
Catherine, go.
OK. Ben, pour les organisations, c'est sûr que des organisations comme Amnesty International, Mining Watch, c'est des organisations qui permettent de s'informer sur différents projets qui sont en cours. Puis sinon, au Québec, c'est sûr qu'il y a différents groupes grassroots qui sont quand même très impliqués pour la solidarité anticoloniale. C'est plus ça que je connais. Là. Il y a les groupes Ni Québec, ni Canada. Il y a les groupes... Attends un peu, j'essaie de me souvenir. C'est un groupe Facebook. Non au plan Nord, ni Tassinane, si je ne me trompe pas. faudrait que j'aille revérifier, mais si vous voulez m'écrire, en fait, je peux vous en envoyer différents groupes qui sont actifs, là. Ouais, pour l'instant, c'est ça qui me vient en tête.
Dr. Waldron, I don't know if you wanted to also answer or.
Well, I think in terms of making change, I think it's all the things I said earlier. Schools, young people, mobilizing, civil disobedience. If I can think of one kind of national organization, I don't know if you've heard of Extinction Rebellion, and they might be a bit radical to some people, but I mentioned them because they're national. I could talk about the Ecology Action Center in Nova Scotia, but that's very provincial. So Extinction Rebellion kind of does what I said earlier. Yes, they're focused on environmental issues and racism, but they also connect it to state violence of various forms for everybody, queer people, genderqueer people, Black people, Indigenous people. They make the connections to various social and economic and political issues, and they connect it also to environmental racism, and they may be seen as radical. But I like what they do and I like what they stand for. So they have different chapters across Canada. So I would say Extinction Rebellion.
Perfect. Thank you both. Merci à vous. I think that's the end of the questions, I believe.
I would just have one little question of general interest, I think. So the question is for both of you. I just want to know if there's a way that maybe people could reach to you, contact you if they have further questions, or to get the groups that maybe they could join, or maybe follow you on social media for Dr. Waldron if they want to know about all the initiatives that you have. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so the organizers of this talk have my email. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, but if you go to my Enrich website, you'll get all the links to social media. I just wanted to say one thing in terms of the groups to connect with. I would prefer that you connect with the groups that are associated with the Indigenous and Black communities in your area. So I would say the first thing you do is find out which Indigenous communities in your area are dealing with environmental issues, because they're grassroots. And I would say find ways to support those grassroots initiatives that are directly coming from Indigenous communities in your area. That would be the first thing. And then I would say, yeah, Extinction Rebellion and all the other initiatives. But first thing, find out which Indigenous community in your area is dealing with these issues. Find their Facebook page, and then reach out to them to find out how can you support. And then if you don't find any, or maybe you don't get a response, then try the ones that Catherine mentioned and Extinction Rebellion.
I agree. And I wrote my email and Facebook if ever you want to talk to me. And otherwise, I just had a question for you, Dr. Waldron, if it's okay.
Yeah.
It's a quick question. I was wondering at the Picton Landing, since they closed the treatment plant, I was wondering if there were any engagement for like how to decontaminate or restore the sites, or it's just closed and now like the community are they stuck with the results, or do they have support to make it better now?
They have all the supports they need. Often when Michelle, who's in the film, she's been doing various events with me, and I say to her, people are going to ask you how they can help you or how they can support you. And she said, Ingrid, to tell you the truth, we're in the process of doing it right now, and we really don't need any support. They're kind of finalizing things now. It's in the process. It's closed, but there's still other things to deal with. But I think they have all the support that they need. So she said to me that she doesn't need any help from the public or anything like that. So things are going, I think, pretty well. She did express some concern that something may happen again that will potentially put the community at risk, but they're watching it. I forgot exactly what she said, so there was a little bit concerned. But around the pulp mill, it's closed, but there are things to finalize.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Est-ce qu'il y avait d'autres questions chez les personnes qui sont ici? Vous pouvez ouvrir votre micro. OK. Donc, je pense je vais repartager mon écran.
Oh, let me do the Enrich project website. Let me give my website because I think that URL is not correct. So Enrich project.
Okay. All right. Est-ce que c'est tout pour les questions? Tout est beau? Yeah? OK. Est-ce que tout le monde voit mon PowerPoint? Okay, good. All right. So thank you, Dr. Waldron, and thank you, Catherine. We're gonna go on with the end of our presentation. Donc, on va continuer avec la conclusion de notre présentation. On voulait faire des petites breakout rooms, mais on n'aura pas le temps, mais j'aimerais ça quand même inviter les gens ici à réfléchir sur qu'est-ce que nous, on peut faire par rapport au racisme environnemental et quelles actions on pourrait poser pour remédier à ce problème-là. Et aussi, en tant qu'IFMSA à Québec, on peut quand même prendre action par rapport à ce problème-là. Sinon, on va quand même tout de suite passer à la conclusion qu'on avait préparée pour vous pour faire un peu un parallèle avec ce qui se passe à l'international parce que le racisme environnemental n'est pas nécessairement juste un problème au Canada et au Québec. On voulait juste vous démontrer quelques cas de racisme environnemental qu'on a trouvés à l'international pour faire une ouverture là-dessus.
Oui, donc d'abord, si on commence avec les États-Unis, on a trouvé l'exemple d'une ville qui s'appelle Flint au Michigan, qui est en fait vraiment proche du Québec, qui est la ville surnommée symbole du racisme environnemental. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien en passant?
Oui, c'est beau.
OK, ça, je n'étais pas sûre. Donc, dans le fond, ce qu'ils ont trouvé, suite à une étude, c'était qu'il y avait, dans le fond, il y avait des enfants qui avaient un niveau élevé de plomb dans leur sang. C'était particulièrement notable dans les quartiers socio-économiquement désavantagés. Donc, comme vous pouvez voir en bas à droite, la photo, on voit l'eau à gauche qui est l'eau vraiment polluée, dans le fond, avec du plomb, puis à droite, c'est comme de la meilleure eau. Le problème, c'est que c'est une ville qui est à prédominance noire à 57%, là, comme on peut le voir. Puis, dans le fond, c'est comme, on parle d'héritage de la ségrégation. Dans le fond, les personnes de race noire ont plus tendance à vivre dans un habitat qui est moins salubre et dans des vieilles habitations. Puis, qui dit vieille habitation dit peut-être de la plomberie ou de la tuyauterie qui est plus vieille, due à la corrosion. Donc, c'est ça qui aurait pu amener justement ce niveau de plomb dans le sang de ces enfants-là. C'est pas écrit, mais j'avais lu que c'est environ 8000 enfants par année qui buvaient de l'eau polluée. Donc, c'est ça. C'est un exemple de racisme environnemental, dans le fond, proche de chez nous aux États-Unis.
Parfait. Alors maintenant, je vais vous parler d'un cas de racisme environnemental en France. Donc, en fait, en France, une étude a démontré que pour chaque pourcentage d'humidité d'une ville, il y a 30% de chances en plus pour qu'on trouve à proximité un incinérateur à déchets émetteur de substances toxiques, cancérigènes ou génératrices d'autres types de pathologies. En matière de pollution de l'air, les pics les plus importants en région parisienne sont enregistrés à Saint-Denis, dans le 93, en contrebas du périphérique et de l'A1. Ce département est balafré par les autoroutes urbaines et en permanence survolé par les avions de Roissy et du Bourget. Les nuisances sonores et la pollution dégradent les conditions de vie des zones les plus pauvres de France, où habitent un grand nombre d'immigrés récents, ainsi que des milliers de Roms coincés dans des bidonvilles insalubres.
Ensuite, moi, je vais vous parler d'un exemple en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée, dans le fond, qui s'est passé là, dans le passé de 1972 à 1989. Et donc, c'était la mine Panguna en Papouasie-Nouvelle-Guinée, qui était une source de racisme environnemental, dans le fond, qui a été une mine qui a été installée sur des territoires autochtones qu'on appelle les bougainvilliers. Puis, dans le fond, ce qui s'est passé, c'est que on leur a carrément enlevé des terres qui auraient pu avoir le potentiel d'être des terres pour l'agriculture. Puis on les a relocalisées dans des logements médiocres. Ils ont reçu un paiement sous-évalué pour compenser pour leurs terres. Puis il y a eu une grosse dégradation environnementale là, qui a été causée par rapport à ça. Donc, malgré que ce soit un exemple dans le passé, c'est quand même un très bon exemple de racisme environnemental qui est quand même relativement récent.
OK. Finalement, je vais vous parler un peu de la ville de Guiyu en Chine. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Ouais. Okay. Il y a quelques années, il s'agissait de l'un des plus grands sites de recyclage de déchets électroniques. On y retrouvait des milliers d'ordinateurs jetés près des berges, contenant du cadmium, du cuivre, du plomb et des PVDE. Et ces matériaux se retrouvent dans l'eau et contaminent l'approvisionnement local en eau. Notamment, le niveau de plomb dans la rivière de Lianjiang était 190 fois plus élevé que le seuil de sécurité de l'OMS. Et les résidents n'ont pas d'autre choix que d'utiliser l'eau contaminée parce que l'alternative, soit l'approvisionnement en eau par camion, est trop coûteuse. Et 80% des enfants souffraient de saturnisme, qui est une intoxication par le plomb. En 2013, le gouvernement de Guangzhou a forcé le déménagement des ateliers de recyclage dans un parc industriel et a commencé à imposer des régulations pour mieux contrôler la pollution. Le résultat est que la qualité de l'air et de l'eau se sont améliorées, mais les processus de recyclage des déchets électroniques continuent dans les parcs industriels et en fait continuent à produire de la pollution malheureusement.
Donc, en gros, ce sont juste quelques exemples parmi tant d'autres, mais on peut voir que le racisme environnemental, c'est un phénomène qu'on observe partout dans le monde, puis pas juste au Canada et au Québec. Donc, c'est ça qui met fait à notre session sur le racisme environnemental. Donc, on espère que ce fut aussi enrichissant pour vous que ça l'a été pour nous. Puis, on veut aussi remercier, encore une fois, nos conférenciers. Donc, merci Catherine, puis Dr. Walgen, qui est malheureusement plus là, mais... Donc, c'est ça. Puis aussi, si vous voulez aller voir le documentaire There's Something in the Water, je vous dis c'est super intéressant. Ça ne dure pas trop longtemps, donc pour vrai, là, je vous le conseille. Donc, merci beaucoup à tous d'être venus et d'avoir assisté.
Un gros merci. Bonne soirée.